Good morning. My name is Khushboo Prashant, and along with Jegan, my teammate, we'll be presenting our thesis, which is titled as Planet of Fields. Planet of Fields means putting more agriculture in cities, a total shift to agroecology, making agriculture more pleasant and rural areas a little more urban, encouraging cities to have a sustainable relationship with their hinterlands as defined by Max Eyal, author of People's Green New Deal. Our thesis looks into using agroecology, intensification, and enterprise stacking as a tool to stitch the urban and rural disconnect, using Greenbelt as a potential spatial zone connecting both. We started by looking at various precedents, UK's larger context, case studies of agroecology, chose Bristol as our site, proposed policies, and studied alternatives to annual cereals like Renza. First, we look at the existing disconnect between cities and their context, as well as some of the causes, then at some alternatives, models, and precedents. Broadacre City by Frank Lloyd Wright completely disperses the modern city and gives each family at least an acre of land. We even looked at Garden City by Ebenezer Howard and one of the most recent example by Sebastian Marot, which looks at 4 scenarios incorporating the capitalist metropolis takes over the countryside.
To place this idea of Planet of Fields in the UK, we choose UK's green belts as the context. The aim of the green belt as a land use designation is to maintain open green spaces and prevent cities' uncontrolled outward expansion. They are in a unique position to play a role in addressing problems of the UK food system due to the proximity to the urban centers, given most of the demand comes from the cities. This demand is mainly met by monoculture, which is highly detrimental to the soil health and biodiversity. A large part of agricultural land is in UK is used to produce animal feed or for animal grazing, and almost half of the land required to feed UK is overseas. This leads to a heavy dependence on international imports. Naturally grown food is very reliant on government subsidies in order to compete, and ends up being sold at the prices which does not actually reflect the cost of production. Parallel to this, land ownership in UK is concentrated as 1% owns more than half of England. This is closely linked to food production as the global demand and its demand dynamics pushes large landowners towards intensive farming to meet the demands of global supply chains. The recent departure of UK has resulted in significant policy changes related to farming incentives. However, they still exclude the farm below 5 hectares. The incentives by DEFRA is delivered through landscape recovery, sustainable farming incentive, and countryside stewardship, and directly delivered to farmers and land managers, which advises both to take separate actions on the land to get access to the incentives. Here are some of the actions in the countryside stewardship. For example, an organic production would give 115 to 887 pounds to a farmer per hectare. However, these actions are limited to the boundaries of the farm and produced automized results and does not work across. So far, we have seen 3 issues: monoculture and global supply chain, concentrated ownership, automized land management schemes, and how should we respond to the present-day disconnect in the relation to the green belt and the agriculture policy.
For which agroecology can be a way as it breaks the current dominant system and produces food in more sympathetic way and in a synergy with all the natural systems. It is based on bottom-up and territorial processes, helping to deliver contextualized solutions to local problems based on the co-creation of knowledge, combining science with traditional practices and local knowledge of producers. To better understand it, we chose Wakelands, an agroecological farm, as a case study, which is intensified with the idea of agriculture plus ecology. Enterprise stacking, which includes bakery, clothing with natural materials like hemp, fresh veg boxes supplies, and beekeeping as well. The main takeaway from here is to form a more closed system, agroecology plus farm intensification and enterprise stacking in today's context. We further look at many agroecological farms, which also works with the idea ranging from the intensification, enterprise stacking, providing community support, and forming shorter supply chain. Community Farm, located in Bristol, collects food from many smaller farmers around and packs it into supplies within 15-mile radius. This, as one of the case study, helped us to choose our site further. To further understand the value of these farms, we calculated social value index, which included direct financial revenues, increased capacity and unpaid labor, provision of social needs, downstream benefits, and understood the social value index formed by this farm, which is valued 3 more times than size of monoculture farms of this size. So the question is, can these forms of intensification and enterprise stacking be reflected on farms across the Greenbelt? And how can the idea of agroecology work together with the current structure of existing policies?
To see how this can work out, we took Bristol's Greenbelt as our site of investigation. The Bristol Greenbelt majorly consists of woodlands, arable lands, and grasslands. But the woodlands here are fragmented. A1 Wildlife Trust study shows the promising potential that these woodlands can be stitched together and acted as a corridor. The same has been done for the grassland, but however, the current actions that are limited to the farm boundaries that are related to farm boundaries and does not resonate with the idea of these corridors. However, there are around 119 existing farm clusters within the UK, which basically groups of farmers based on the idea and work towards the common goals, which is mostly ecology based. We had interviews with the farm clusters and the farmers who wants to be in the cluster. It is understood that existing farm clusters needed policies which allow them to link up and work together with ecological layers. But the farmers who wanted to be in the cluster feels it would be better to have shared assets and knowledge and work together as a group. That brings us to a policy proposal which deals with the issues which we discussed earlier. It responds to the issues such as automized land management schemes, monoculture and global supply chain, concentrated ownership through consolidating the farms through ecological corridors, local business and supply chains, shared models of ownership with enterprise stacking and farm intensification. The policy modification of the existing structure of the DEFRA is done at 3 levels. At the UK level, all the agroecological practices must be acknowledged and incentivized, and contest-based actions are advised to farmers and land managers, also allowing the possibility of combining multiple actions within a farm. To coordinate this, an optional body called ecological clusters, which sits between the landscape recovery, SFI, and contested stewardship, and land managers and the farmers, which a land manager or a farmer can sign up to and work together as a group.
To support this ecological actions, we created a catalog for each corridors. For example, in riparian corridor, species were divided into submerged, emerged, and woodland tolerant to waterlogged conditions, were studied and compiled together, keeping in mind the fauna species which it supports as well. The intention is to transform the landscape using the catalog combined with location-based actions as a guide to stitch the fragmented corridors and incentivize it with the landscape. For example, species-specific planting, crop rotation, edge management, woodland creation, and other such actions are informed by the land and its context. This will further add value to the enterprise stacking and intensification as well.
To efficiently evaluate the ecological success of these policies, we referenced it against the existing successful agroecological farms. And it is understood that if we just get 20% of success or 20% of all the farmers on board with us, we can efficiently double the woodland corridors of Bristol in just 25 years.
To facilitate this ecological clusters, Bristol Council, a long-standing body for years, can be used as the cluster farms and farms based on the shared machinery, assets, and type of cultivation. Bristol Council can also play a crucial role in ownership transfer. The process can be streamlined where the retiring existing farmers' ownership is transferred to the council, and new entrant would get a council land to experiment his ideas on the land before he has the actual ownership which is transferred.
But however, DEFRA as a body works in isolation and does not resonate with any other industries. how can we connect these policies with the local business? To develop the case further, we took wheat, the most cultivated crop in the Bristol's green belt, as our case. But however, the current cultivation of wheat is very exhausting on the land, for which we took Krenza, a long-rooted perennial wheat, as a potential replacement. Cultivating Krenza in the land can be very light on the earth, and as it requires no tilling for more than 5 years. These species are long-rooted and can sequester more carbon than the conventional wheat and can fix the nitrogen of the soil when it planted together with other species. To further understand, we took 3 byproducts of Krenza: beer, bread, and straw. Beer was investigated by our fellow teammate from the MSc project, where he said 1,273 hectares of agroecological cultivation of these perennial grains is enough to cover all the demand that is from the breweries of Bristol. And bread and straw are the cases which is investigated by us.
So we got in touch with Wild Farmed, owned by Andy Cato. He collaborated with various farmers who grew perennial wheat and other cereals across UK. The wheat was collected and milled in various locations, one being near Cotswold, and the flour was sold across multiple cafes and other bigger joints around UK, promoting perennial cereal agriculture. The case study helped us to understand the process of bread making, which majorly includes milling and baking. These 2 processes can be implemented on small scales as well as larger scales depending on the consumers and the span of the entire supply chain.
When it comes to straw, Agile Homes and Modcell is the main company which fabricates these panels offsite and uses it in the construction site. The process involved in this is circular, and the flying factories becomes the most crucial infrastructure. These are temporary infrastructures set up at the place of construction. The main idea of flying factories is making a supply chain shorter, and this type of construction adds up a social value index of about 57 pence to 99 pence for every £1 spent. We had also interviews with the people working with straw and understood that the initiatives of these resourcing of materials from the country's own forest. And it is also understood that there is a much wider acceptance for these kind of buildings, as ecological building societies are readily funding this type of buildings. The process of bread and straw panel making can be streamlined, and these enterprises can be stacked within the farm to form a new economic value on the social value index. To experiment this, we can use Bristol existing council lands, which can actually highly benefit from this kind of intensification. And we took the transect between the Bath and the Bristol to experiment, as a major residential and commercial developments are being proposed around this area currently.
Starting with the green belt, this is all the farmers that produce straw in the green belt. We further zoomed into into a chosen transact where one main council owned land and farms closer in proximity to the city can be chosen. Straws and the bread can be collected from the farms around and be transported to the main site. These enterprise stacking would change the farm's landscape drastically. The new species used would increase the carbon sequestration, and the new farming methods can lighter the straw processed within the area.
Yeah, so that's all the wheat farm in the Bristol. If you zoom into one cluster, that's all the farms that produces wheat within clusters. And based on the proximity, 2 main sites can be chosen to collect straw and wheat from the other farm, which can be processed within the farm and be transported to all the other sites within the Bristol. To further zooming into one site, so these kind of intensification can drastically change the farm landscape into a more intensified one. For example, it can highly benefit the social value index, and the new crop would increase the ecological value so much. And the straw infrastructure like straw storage and straw panel manufacturing can be fixed within the farm. And since this is in closer proximity to the cities, people would be more encouraged to come and see what is happening. And it can also be stacked up with the enterprises like bread and beekeeping and other businesses. So just to understand what kind of new economy that this farm is going to produce, the new social value index that this farm is going to form would be much larger than the community farm itself. However, the revenue generated from this farm's manufacturing of Krenza and Krenza straw panel making and bread is more tangible than the community farm. And these sort of clusters and intensification farms can be done across the Bristol, and these straw businesses can be widely benefited from the existing woodland corridors, as 15 to 25% of the existing woods required for the industry can come just from the green belt in the next 25 years.
And even the grassland corridor further adds a lot of benefits in terms of perennial crops that grows, and that can be used as one of the modules for the intensifications as well. The design could act as a prototype which can be repeated across the green belts of UK. The thesis promotes agroecology, intensification, enterprise stacking, and cultivating perennial crops using green belt as a spatial transition between the urban and the hinterlands. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, both. That was really interesting, and another presentation which really intelligently uses an existing governance and spatial relationship, the Greenbelt and the proximity of urban centres, as a pivot or a bridgehead into a transitional vision, which I think is really great. I really like your visualizations and the variety of aesthetics that you mobilise. I think one thing, maybe I don't know if this is a question or if you want to respond to this, but I think the role within the analysis of the social value index is interesting, and I think a little bit underexplored. And there are some tensions between the maintenance of a kind of commodity economy which we have now, where food is highly commodified, and a transitional vision of the kind of fundamental change which Max Isle and we are talking about. So a little bit more explanation of where you see thinking through the social value index as being important to overcoming some of those challenges, I think would be welcome. I don't know if you want to explain why you chose to work with the social value index, and even maybe a little bit just on how it works, because I'm not an expert in the methodology involved with the generation of a social value index, and I would have appreciated at least a hint of how that's generated. So yeah, that would be my main sort of question, would be around the social value index, the choice, the political valence of that as a way of encouraging alternative land use decisions, or the facilitation of these kind of things. I also think that the scope from a narrative perspective, and also from a clarity perspective, to speak a little bit about intensification, because intensification is a word that has a dual meaning in agriculture. And agricultural intensification, in the common sense, in a widely used sense, is something that people are deeply opposed to. But you're right to say that these alternative forms of agroecology are intensification in a different way. And I think you just need to make a claim to that concept early on, because it's a really valid and necessary thing. Labour-intensive horticulture is an intense form of agriculture. It requires a lot of energy input, requires a lot of work, requires a lot of knowledge. But that's not always, explicit, because of the understandings of intensification which we have as a result of fossil fuel-derived intensification, for example. So I think that's something to explore as well. It's Kernza, not Krenza. Sorry, I think at some point you got a little bit mixed up, and you kept calling it Krenza, but it is Kernza. So get that now before anything gets printed, hopefully. But no, it was really fantastic. So those are my main comments.
Thank you.
Because I share the same concerns about the social value that you mentioned, but we've been asked by the Land Workers Alliance in the Real Farming Trust for the actual Excel file to calculate. So all of these organizations are really interested in. It was inspired by the social value index that Commonwealth did in the Latino market. So I think this is an interesting topic for discussion.
So, so social value index was basically inspired from a study from Commonwealth. So what they try to do is, so they basically try to break down building spaces. Building spaces. Actually, it was a retrofitted building. So they just modified it and calculated the amount of money that has been hidden and not known. Like it's like the cost that would be saved if I'm a person or if anyone uses the space. So that idea is basically applied to the farm. So, for example, when we say downstream benefits, there is a lot of money that we don't see. For example, we calculated carbon sequestration and downstream benefits. It actually involves a lot of like if we actually have to sequester the carbon that this kind of intensified farm is going to sequester, we would require this amount of money. For example, the carbon credits, it's 83 pounds, almost like 83 pounds for 1 ton of carbon in the UK. So if my farm is going to sequester 10 tons of carbon more than the other farms, then that 30 pounds is basically saved. So that is the hidden thing behind the social value index.
And even when it comes to social value index, when we'd gone to community farm located in Bristol, we could see a lot of people being part of it, like readily being part of it in terms of it could be refugees who are working on the site to have who are attending certain workshops, to certain people from the office's background who were being part of these workshops. So we could see that people in Bristol were readily taking part in terms of knowing what their surrounding context is like when it comes to specifically to agriculture and agroecology.
Just a bit of extension to what Khushboo said. So, for example, if that farm is giving psychological support to these sort of refugees, then the amount spent by NHS to treat them is saved. So that are all the considerations that went behind when we are calculating this social value index.
Yeah. I just have 2 points or questions. I'm not quite sure yet how they'll come out. One is you raised a point about council farms and then sort of a farmer coming onto a council farm, getting some training, and then kind of the ownership going back. I think that's what you meant anyway. And I just kind of wanted to question that a little bit about, council farmland is like a precious commodity now, basically, or a precious asset, and councils often sell it off. And I feel like, in very few councils, once it's sold off, does it ever come back into public ownership? So I just kind of wondered about why you thought it would be good for the farmer potentially to take on that land, as opposed to maybe it being like a permanent training base or something for other farmers. And also I think the other thing that council land maybe has more than others is some of the things you were talking about in terms of policy and being able to set like a set of priorities for a connected area of land. So yeah, that's my first question, was just about why you went for that approach.
Right. So the main idea was that currently there is not one simple body which a lot of new entrants can go to as well and then be part of this entire larger system. So the idea was to introduce a very common platform for everyone where it's not just easier for them to get in, but even like, for example, the shared assets in terms of machinery. So all of that started coming into the picture where it became like a common platform for everybody to enter the system.
Just a bit of addition. So there were these research done by Sustain on how to get access to the land. If I'm a new farmer, I'll have to get into agroecology, or if I'm just a farmer who wants to get into farming. So there's this detailed document. Just put it in the side, but there's this detailed document which detailedly explains the process, like how I should approach other farmers, or like how I should get to know my neighbors, like how to talk to them just to get access to the land and everything. But in the whole study, there was this thing missing, or like one centralized body who sits in between, who can actually facilitate this. So that is why we thought council as a body also owns farms. So if an existing farmer's ownership is transferred to the council before it is transferred to any new farmer, so he could actually get a piece of land from a council farm, like a small holding, where he can like sort of experiment or like just show people what he's going to try and do with the farm. Because the ownership issue, like as we discussed earlier, the large scale privatization pushes like large landowners to take a practice which is very intensive. So if this kind of experimentation is done beforehand, before the transfer of ownership, I think that is the thing we thought would be beneficial for the council to sort of enter and stay in between the process.
Yeah. Sorry.
And just to add, we had this conversation with one of the farmers from Wakelands. So what he mentioned was like, for example, the current system is where you log into DEFRA's website and they take you to a certain platform where they say that, okay, if this is your farm, it shows the farm location and the activities that is happening, but it does not show anything regarding the surrounding context. Like, what are your neighbors doing? What are they growing? Are they part of any cluster farms? Are they part of any council farms? So it is pretty much detached right now. So a common platform will always help all of these farmers to come together and to know what is happening around them as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Basically, I think my point was that I'm more in favour of things staying in common, whether it's council or community land trusts, as opposed to then fragmenting off again into individual ownership. But yeah, thank you for your answer. The one other final question I had was, I'm not sure so much in Bristol, but like around London in particular, a lot of the Greenbelt farmland is used for horse grazing, and that's it. They're not really growing anything. And I was wondering about like how you thought you would engage those sort of landowners in this to bring them into some of the like farm clusters, or in your vision, would you be working with more like productive farmers only? So I just wondered if you could speak to that a bit more.
Right. So we had shown this corridor system that we introduced, where a lot of fragmented woodlands, fragmented grasslands are stitched together. And even Wildlife Trust talks about why is it important to stitch all of these corridors together. So the idea is, if we have, for example, you said that these grasslands which are not productive right now, the idea is to convert them into productive landscapes for future. So if we have to convince the farmers, it's more about how it is going to be part of an intensification program and how it is going to sort of add more ecological values as well as economic values. So that could be one of the methods in which we can sort of push the idea and ask all these farmers to be part of these clusters and then be part of these councils.
Just to add, we can sort of work with both kind of people. Why I would say is, so like the DEFRA transition would sort of end, like the transition fully in 2027. And by 2027, all the incentives, all the money that comes from you is going to cut off. So all the large invasive farms that are going to be like based, like only supported on these kind of like subsidies for monoculture and stuff, would like take a big hit. So that is why it is essential to think about a new economic value that sort of, caters to everything.
Yeah.
So that's what I feel.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks guys. It was a really interesting presentation. It was really well thought through. I was really interested in this concept like enterprise stacking. I think that's like, it was quite an interesting approach, and like how you can create like, sort of synergistic relationships between industries from fields. I was wondering if you've come across like more examples of that. Obviously agriculture is something that really has quite a lot of stacking. I think it was quite interesting you mentioned horses in the green belt. That sort of classic one is you have like a forest and then you graze the pigs on it to have the acorns, and you use the horses on the land, and it's a sort of relationship between these different like species and land management. I just wondered if you came across like, other techniques of land management that sort of use this enterprise stacking concept.
Right. So when it comes to enterprise stacking, again, I'll go back to the case study that we were looking at. So in Wakelands, they had these agroforestry belts where they had apple productions happening, and they had wheat as well growing right next to it. So these belt system, agroforestry belt systems, help them to grow multiple things. And for example, they had an in-house bakery which was serving bread and other bakery items to villages which were in the radius of 12 miles. And there was this stage during crop rotation where they even grow hemp. And that was the hemp straws were being used by the fashion industries, and they were producing textiles out of it. And the apples which were being produced there, it went to another unit where they had juice productions happening, and then the pulp went to another place where they had used it as for another raw material. So when it comes to enterprise stacking, it is supported because we have multiple things growing on site and multiple different economy backgrounds being attached to it. So it's not just the farms that we're looking at. We're looking at, for example, the fashion industry that we're talking about, and we're looking at the bakery industry, and we're looking at multiple other assets which could be attached to it.
Yeah, just it's like, it's not just enterprise also, but you just stack up so many things. So you just, like, as a farmer, what is it in for him is like the different kinds of revenue that is going to be generated and all these kind of stacking together.
Right. So when we talk about intensification, it is not just in terms of the yield that they are producing in farm, but it is even in terms of all these different enterprises which are being a part of this larger system, and how it is facilitating the intensification when they all come together.
That's a question, because we haven't really found any examples of enterprise stacking. And I think the one important aspect of enterprise stacking is that it's not only food. It could be obviously construction materials, but it can also be research. No? In the case of weightlings, it can be attached to university. I mean, food or maybe some kind of prototype, that. But the enterprise stacking remains, is across several industries, and that's, like the potential, and that's why perhaps the green belt is a place where something like that, where many businesses or many enterprises could actually be attaching with what might call a productive landscape.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. I think green belt's really good for it as well, because obviously you've got that sort of synergy between the rural and urban happening in that quite liminal space. Just more of a comment, because we're talking about social value. I really hate social value. And I was really involved in that Commonwealth report on social value. So I would just encourage you to think about it quite critically. And the reason is because it's just really weird. Like, it's social value as opposed to social benefit. What is meant by that is, like, how can we use, like, accounting metrics to ascribe economic value to having, like, more positive social relations? And that is just a very strange way to think about, like, humanity. And the reason we have it in this country is because when David Cameron was passing all the austerity measures that was, like, plunged millions of people into poverty, destroyed the public services, really, damaged, like, the social fabric of this country, they introduced the social value metrics at the same time. And the logic of it was so that organisations like charities, third sector organisations, etc., they would be able to bid on government procurement contracts where otherwise they wouldn't really be able to compete. And what social value frameworks did is they basically ascribed, like, a monetary value in terms of the net saving to the state of not having to provide their services. So if your activity makes people feel better and that stops them getting depression, apparently the value of depression in the UK economy is like £56,000 a year per person. And so they're saying, okay, well, if you do this thing for us, we can save this much money and not having to provide health services. So at the same time as they're cutting away all the services that people actually need to sort of support their lives, they're saying, well, how can we just sort of farm this out on the cheap to some other people and give them a little tool to use this in procurement? So it's really cynical. And what it's given rise to is this entire, like, cottage industry where there's, like, so many different values. There's, like, the Toms, the most successful one, and then there's, like, Hacked, HACT4, that's, like, another one. There's this entire, like, industry of people that now do it. And if you want to subscribe to the Toms platform, it's like £15,000 a year for starters, and like £8,000 a case study. And the people that use it, like these massive corporate developers like Lend-Lease, like, our scheme is going to create all this value, but the value isn't really there. It's like a fiction that's being created through accounting tricks. And it's interesting because in the case of people like in Commonwealth, in the case of Lassing Village, we were just trying to leverage that on the premise that we could create these huge figures very easily using the metrics. But this was just a way of making policymakers engage with us and trying to like leverage this, like, little, like, fault line in the state. But it's all a bit nonsense. So I treat it very, very critically. Would be
I
my-
remember when this started because I was doing my PhD and there was a guy who was doing a PhD on, oh my God, what was it called? Social capital and subjective well-being, i.e. happiness. And actually a lot of this was, and we said to him at the time, this is 15 plus years ago, we said to him at the time, this is exactly what the government will pick up, and boy, they did. Because it was a way of using survey data to quantify well-being. But extremely, extremely tenuous, that research in the first place, which was part of this Kickstarter of the whole thing.
I think that's a very relevant question, whether a concept like this can be used to, how to put it, like, whether you see this, as a way to reform the system, or do you see this as a transition to a different system and to start transforming some of the policies? I mean, that's something that we try to engage in the program, no? Like, because obviously there's some sort of clarity, let's say, that there may be some potential future, for example, using agroecological knowledge and technique, but how to reach there. So you need a transition, and that transition is important, whether you use some of these concepts, which, as you said, one needs to be critical because as many of the things can be, they are tools to co-opt, no? The ways to achieve a just transition. But that's an important thing to, I guess, to engage, as a project, but also as a program, and to be always aware, no, how they're being used, whether, in the Latin village, no, to kind of leverage the power, no, to developers and the actual system, or to just take it, freely and then see that this is something that could work everywhere, no? This is an important point.
Yeah, it's really worth thinking through because it can have a lot of benefits as well, right? It's good to start thinking in things, more dimensions than simply net economic values. And you can really leverage these things. That we've done it quite successfully, to try and get access to buildings that otherwise we couldn't afford, and then give those to community groups. So you can use it beneficially. But I think I'd also just suggest looking it up in other ways as well. So in that Commonwealth report, for example, they use the Treasury's social value green book or whatever it's called. And actually kind of what that shows is that there's benchmarks that people can use for calculating values, and this is quite common in economics. And I think what was more the intent originally with that Commonwealth piece of work was less about looking at social value and looking more at direct economic value, which is created through that sort of in a way, enterprise stacking, like a sort of collection of very small businesses across multiple levels that have a synergistic relationship to each other. And it's what is the economic value that's generated there that wouldn't be generated by the previously proposed development. I think that sort of counterfactual modelling is something you could probably work out how to do relatively simply if you have a data set used as a reference, like the Treasury Green Book. And that, with your concept of enterprise stacking, might be a more genuinely interesting approach to take towards what the value is there, as opposed to these sort of slightly abstractions on abstractions of abstractions, social value sets.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.